Well, good to see you. Well done for making it out tonight. And we're here in our last week of the series on the apocalypses of the prophets. Week 4, we're going to be covering Zechariah chapter 14 in 2 parts tonight. And so just as a reminder of what we looked at last week, Zechariah and his little apocalypse had been dealing with the two facets of Israel's future national salvation. That is via the events of the time of Jacob's trouble, also known to us as the tribulation. They are going to ultimately be saved, both spiritually and physically. And earlier in chapter 12, he began with the events leading into their physical salvation. But then in chapter 13, he's put that aside for a time to focus on their spiritual salvation, which of course is required prior to the second coming occurring. So keeping this in mind, that concept that their spiritual salvation has to precede their physical deliverance. So now in chapter 14, he's going to pick up on the topic of Israel's physical salvation, returning to the campaign of Armageddon, setting the scene by going over some of the elements of chapter 12, before then expanding and giving some new revelation, including events after the tribulation that are going to take place during the messianic kingdom period. And that's what we're going to look at in our second part tonight. So let's start with chapter 14, verses 1 to 4 of Zechariah. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I'll gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and women raped. Half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So as I'm saying, as a reminder here, Zechariah has returned to focus on this third stage of the campaign of Armageddon. So just to remind ourselves, the first stage was when Antichrist gathered his armies into the valley of Jezreel. Okay, that was in the northern part of Israel. Stage 2 was in response, the believers seeing that, because the sixth bowl judgment dried up the Euphrates so he could move his army across. Then the believers seeing that understood now was their time to destroy Babylon. And so he's left it undefended, so while he's got all his armies in one area, they attack Babylon and destroy it. And so Zechariah is now restating what he mentioned earlier about this future event of the Gentile nations gathering in against Jerusalem. So they've come from that northern valley of where Armageddon is, and they've now come upon Jerusalem to attack it. And the way he introduces this topic is a little bit different, because he says here, behold, a day is coming. So this is not the day, but a day. So then this refers to a specific part of the day of the Lord that occurs toward the end of the 7 years of the Great Tribulation. See also Revelation 2 verse 22 and 7 verse 14. So he's gathered his forces in the northern valley of Galilee, and Antichrist then has now headed south to attack Jerusalem. And so Zechariah is now revealing the outcomes of that battle. So remember, they did defend it valiantly. Some were like David, others were like the angel of the Lord, but ultimately they are defeated. And so the first outcome of the defeat is that the spoil will be divided in their midst. In other words, the survivors will be gathered, and they'll have to stand and watch as the spoil from the battle is divided amongst the enemy. And that's because although the battle will have come at great cost to Antichrist's forces, he will ultimately be victorious. But this will be, in fact, Antichrist's last victory. And following the defeat, the enemy forces we see are described as undertaking a brutal plundering of the city, going from house to house looking for the spoils of war. The other outcome is evil acts of violence that have been carried out by the forces of Antichrist, including women being raped. Following this horrific abuse, half of the Jewish survivors will be taken to exile as slaves, which means they'll be transported out of the land of Israel to places around the world. This group will include Jewish believers who will ultimately be part of the ingathering from the four corners of the earth following Messiah's second coming, as seen in Isaiah 11 verses 10 to 11. The other half of the survivors will be left or imprisoned in Jerusalem, and we're going to see later that they experience being rescued from Jerusalem by events in relation to the seventh bowl judgment. keeping in mind that the majority of the remnant are at this point located outside the land in Bosra. This means that following his victory, Antichrist is then going to turn his attentions south again and move south again, and this will become the fourth stage of the campaign, as talked about in Jeremiah 49:13-14. And stage 5, of course, is the national salvation of Israel spiritually, which, of course, Zechariah has also already referenced back in chapter 13. So now his focus shifts on stages that occur after that, stages 6 to 8. So just as a reference, stage 6 would be the second coming of Messiah. Stage 7 is the battle that follows, which starts in Bosra and then moves up to the valley outside Jerusalem. And stage 8 will be the victory ascent of Messiah following the battle. So he's covering those stages. So notice what he says here. The Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall be moved northward and the other half southward. So in the context of facing imminent annihilation at the hands of Antichrist, Israel will, in those final 3 days of the tribulation, will finally come to national salvation spiritually and then call on Messiah to return and save them physically, which, as Zechariah reveals here, he will indeed do. The Lord, the Jewish messianic God-man king, will go out or forth out of the heavenly realm and return to earth to fight. We see this described in Revelation chapter 19. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. Revelation 19:11. So thinking about the fact that the defeat of Jerusalem has already occurred, and therefore that particular battle has already been completed, this then is a separate battle that follows on after that, which, as Zechariah has already stated back in chapter 12 verse 7, will be to save the tents of Judah first. And notice also that in this battle is the Lord himself who is fighting, which again is in contrast to the battle that had been completed in Jerusalem, which you recall included the inhabitants of the city. And so we see the fact that the Lord himself fights this battle and actually fights it by himself, mentioned by the prophet Isaiah, who pictures Messiah following his return, having defeated the enemy at Bosra. Here it is in Isaiah 63. Oops, sorry, went too far. Isaiah 63. Who is this who comes from Edom in crimson garments from Bosra, he who is splendid in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength? Answer: it is I speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. Question: why is your apparel red and your garments like his who treads the winepress? Answer: I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments and stained all my apparel. So when Isaiah has this vision, he himself is located in Jerusalem, and he's looking south to Edom, and more specifically to Bosra. He asks, who is this one who he sees in splendid apparel, like a king, marching in the greatness of his strength? The answer is that the one who speaks is the one speaking who is speaking in righteousness and is mighty to save. This means that this is Messiah returning as king. A reference in Revelation would be chapter 19, 11 through 16. He is the one who will defeat Antichrist and his armies in Bosra in Edom. Today is known as Petra, in the country of, or in the area of southern Jordan. And notice it specifically states that he says he does this alone. Following which Isaiah sees him marching north to rescue Jerusalem. And it's there he will complete the battle, with any remaining enemy forces being wiped out along the way. It's after that that we then have the victory ascent of Messiah up to the top of the Mount of Olives, which of course overlooks Jerusalem. Now, it's that particular verse about the ascent of the Mount of Olives, combined with a statement in the New Testament, that has led to the mistaken idea that Jesus at his second coming, that will start the second coming at the Mount of Olives. But if we look at those passages carefully, along with this other prophetic passage that we've looked at, such as in Isaiah 63, we can see that's not actually the case. Because even if you look at Zechariah, it states that he's gone out to battle before he stands on the Mount of Olives. And then also regarding the passage in the New Testament where it states, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who is taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." Notice, and that's in Acts chapter 1 verse 11, they don't say he will return to the same place, but rather he will return in the same way or the same manner, that is from the clouds of heaven. So returning back to Zechariah, once the battle is finished, that Jesus brings this campaign of Armageddon to an end. And so he will do so by standing on the Mount of Olives as a victory ascent, and it's following that a great earthquake occurs, which is the seventh bowl judgment as given in Revelation 16 verses 17 to 21. This will cause a great geographical change to occur in the area of the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem, as that, of course, is located to the east of the city. This earthquake will cause the Mount of Olives to split into two on an east-west axis, and this will result in there being a wide valley running east to west. This means that a new valley will cut through the midst of the Mount of Olives, so that part of the Mount of Olives moves to the north, and the other part moves to the south. So in essence, it will end up being two smaller mountains with a wide valley in between them. Then we look to the results of the second coming. This is in verses 5 to 11 of chapter 14. "And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azel, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him." So given that Jerusalem lies directly west of the Mount of Olives, this means that this split also causes quite significant destruction to the buildings in Jerusalem, which in turn enables those Jewish captives that had been held captive there to be able to escape. So like a little bit like we see in the New Testament with the doors opening and so on. They can get out because of the earthquake. So they'll be now having been set free spiritually, having come to faith by Messiah, Isaiah 61, 1-2, they're now going to be set free physically. And note that following the earthquake, they're said to flee into the valley of the mountains, plural, because having been split into two parts, the Mount of Olives has become two separate mountains. And Zechariah then compares this fleeing following a large earthquake to a historical event that occurred during the times of King Uzziah, when they also fled out of the city. That's recorded, if you're interested, in Amos chapter 1 verse 1. This destruction of Jerusalem is why there will have to be a new Jerusalem built for the messianic millennial kingdom. Now, although Zechariah focuses on what is happening in relation to the Mount of Olives, this massive earthquake in connection to the seventh bowl judgment results in geographical changes globally, as is recorded in the book of Revelation chapter 16. The great city, that's talking about Jerusalem, was split into three parts, and the cities of the nation fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great, to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath, and every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. So now, although Messiah does fight alone, as he said, he doesn't arrive alone, because with him are a group called the Holy Ones. This fact is also described in Revelation as well, Revelation 19, 13 to 14. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God, and the armies, plural, of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. Now we know from Matthew chapter 16, 27 and 25, 31, that one of these armies would consist of the angelic host. But the plural of armies tells us that there is another distinct group as well, which of course will be the church saints who were raptured prior to the tribulation and return with him at his second coming. We would now be in an immortal, incorruptible state, and so we would indeed qualify to be called holy ones. That may not be true now, but it will be then. Revelation 19 verse 8. So Jude also speaks of this coming of holy ones as a prophecy of Enoch. I know it's verse 14 to 15, not sure which chapter in Jude, I'll let you choose that one. It was also about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with tens of thousands of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against them." So notice he's coming with his holy ones. So then, alongside these earthquake changes, there's going to be some significant global changes as well. I'm sure that's in trouble with that one. Oops, sorry. Not sure why this is not working. Okay, not sure if that's the right one or not. Does this one start with... Oh, yes, it does. Sorry, get a bit lost there. "On that day there shall be no light, cold or frost, and there shall be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light." So Zechariah now describes some unusual conditions affecting nature that occur in that day, that is in conjunction with the second coming. Given this is the seventh bowl, this is consistent with the seventh seal and seventh trumpet judgments. Because what happens is when we get to the final version of each, there are these massive convulsions in nature. Now, the precise meaning of what Zechariah is saying here is obscure, which in a sense is ironic, because in fact that's describing the general idea that sources of natural life will in fact be obscured. The first is the impact on light, as in that day there will be no light as in sunlight, and in fact all natural light sources will be diminished or be concealed, which of course is interesting when one considers that God is light, and also that Jesus says that he is the light of the world, and will of course have returned in his full Shekinah glory. So the inference might be that the world's natural lights are being submitted to God's light and his Shekinah glory. And of course this is signifying the end of the times of the Gentiles, the end of the mystery kingdom, and of course the dawn of the messianic kingdom. It is described as being one day which is known to the Lord. These changes of light during the messianic kingdom are also spoken of by Isaiah. He says, "Moreover, the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be sevenfold, as the light of 7 days, and the day when the Lord binds up the brokenness of his people and heals the wounds inflicted by his blow." Isaiah 30:26. So whatever the case, this is demonstrating Messiah's sovereign control over the earth. And we're going to see in our final session that will also include his ability to control the weather. So that's the next one I should have had up. Sorry about that. So this is the messianic river. "On that day living waters shall flow out of Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft, on its site from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Heniel to the king's winepress. And it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security." So following the earthquake, living waters, so that's moving water, not still water, will start to flow out from Jerusalem. Now, if you've been to Jerusalem, you'll know there is already a water source which is currently contained within Hezekiah's tunnel. However, following the earthquake, the area will be split open, and remembering the valley runs east to west, and so now we get some idea as to the extent of this valley. As the living waters flow out to the eastern sea, which is the Dead Sea, and out to the western sea, which is the Mediterranean. So given the increased light during the Messianic kingdom, this would seem to also impact the weather, so that this river will not dry up as it normally might in summer, nor will it freeze up, so that means there won't be an ice age following the second coming. The prophets Joel and Ezekiel 47, 1-12, give us more details about this Messianic river. As Joel says in 3 verse 18, "And in that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and hills shall flow with milk, and all the stream beds of Judah shall flow with water. A fountain shall come forth from the house of the Lord and water the valley of Shittim." That's Joel 3 verse 18. So in parallel to the spiritual fountain that was mentioned back in 13, on that day there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness. It's Zechariah 13 verse 1. Now here we have a physical fountain, which Ezekiel describes as gradually going deeper and deeper the further it flows away from the temple. So he starts by saying that the Lord brought him to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple towards the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar, Ezekiel 47 verse 1. So it begins as sort of a fairly small amount of water, a trickle or just a small amount coming out. But then in verse 2 he moves about 500 metres down the stream. It's 1,000 cubits. At that point he checks it out and it's ankle deep. And then verse 3 he moves another 1,000 cubits. So we're about a kilometre away from the temple at this point. And by this point it's actually waist deep. So you can see it's starting to get deeper quite quickly. And then he goes another 1,000 cubits. This is now we're at a total of about 1.5 kilometres. And at that point, it's so deep that one would have to swim to get over it. You couldn't just walk through it. So given that there is a messianic temple that's going to be operating throughout the kingdom period, of course, this would require a water source for the various activities to operate a temple. Now, whereas in the past, the priests had to go down from the temple down into the pool of Siloam and to draw water and come back up with the water, now that water is going to be accessible right from the area of the temple sanctuary itself. Now, another outcome is the branch that goes out to the Dead Sea will cause it to come to life with fish. So much so that it'll actually be able to support a fishing industry in the Dead Sea, something that should be unthinkable at the moment. So this river will be a water supply for the Messianic millennial Jerusalem and the areas of agriculture either side of it. And it goes on to say, "And the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name will be one." So the ultimate result of the return of the King of Kings is that he will begin his sovereign rule here on earth, not only over Israel, but the whole earth. And during this messianic kingdom, two things will be true, amongst other things. Firstly, the Lord will be one. That means he alone will be worshipped. There will be no false gods or no idols that will be worshipped in the messianic kingdom. Secondly, his name will be one. That is, he won't be referred to by any false names. And that also implies that unlike in our modern world, where it's often a curse word, in the messianic kingdom, his name will be revered, respected. And we see an example in Hosea of a name that he won't be called by anymore in the messianic kingdom, when Hosea says, "In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and she'll be remembered by my name no more." And so we see there's a particular name that's been taken out of the vocab, so to speak. So the context of Hosea chapter 2, verses 16 to 17 is in that day. And that's referring to the future messianic kingdom. And of course, in Hebrew, the word Baal means master or husband. However, of course, due to its long association with the pagan god by the same name, it will no longer be used by the nation of Israel during the Messianic kingdom. They will use the alternative issue, which means man, including the concept of husband or to a wife, or male. So that will be the alternative word used. They won't use this word Baal anymore, or Baal. Now we also see some topographical changes that will occur following this massive earthquake in the land of Israel at large. So apart from the area of Jerusalem, which remember remains aloft, he will talk about that, the rest of the land becomes like a plain, flat area. So in Hebrew, the Arabah, including all the area north of Gebar. Now, that today is about 9 to 10 kilometres north of the current location of Jerusalem. And all the other area south of Rimmon, which is about 50 to 55 kilometres to the south. So the one's to the north, this one's to the south of Jerusalem. All of those areas, either way, going north or south, will become like a plain. So keep in mind that following the earthquake, which is splitting the Mount of Olives, these distances, of course, will change because the split will add more distance between those 2 points. But whereas the areas north and south of Jerusalem will become a flat plain, about 60 to 65 kilometres, give or take, depending on how much further they're moved, then the location of Messianic Jerusalem in between them will be very different. It will be located on a plateau, on the top of a mountain, meaning geographically it matches its position spiritually as being the location of the house of the Lord, where all the nations will come. Zechariah then mentions certain areas in relation to the city. Now, unfortunately for us, these locations of these areas have been pretty much lost to history and are no longer really known. However, what limited information we do have, they do seem to represent a rough outline of Jerusalem. So what that means is that all of Jerusalem will be lifted up. That's in contrast to the Jerusalem we see today, of course, because if you go to the southern end of Jerusalem, which is the city of David, that's quite a lot lower than the Temple Mount. And so in the Messianic kingdom, it's all going to be lifted up. It's going to be a flat plateau on the top of the mountain. And so all parts of Jerusalem, including the city of David and the northern end, the Temple Mount today, are all going to be part of this new Jerusalem that is lifted up. And keep in mind the Messianic temple, won't be located during the Messianic kingdom inside the actual city of Jerusalem, but rather towards the northern end of this plateau, with Jerusalem at the southern end. During the Messianic kingdom, the city will remain inhabited. And the decree of utter destruction that related to Israel's disobedience, of course, but now because of national obedience and salvation, they're going to remain in a perpetual state of being obedient to the Lord. And because of that, Jerusalem will never again be destroyed due to Israel's disobedience, because Israel won't be disobedient. They'll stay obedient. And so now Jerusalem and its inhabitants will dwell in true peace or true security, one that is, of course, secured by the very Prince of Peace himself. Other references, Isaiah 2 verse 2, Micah 4 verse 1, and Ezekiel 40 verse 1, to look at the topographical changes that are occurring in this time period. And then we have the destruction of the enemy. Get that? And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they're standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. And on that day a great panic from the Lord shall fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other. Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. So in very stark contrast to the blessings that an obedient Israel will enjoy following the second coming, Now Isaiah focuses on the divine judgment of the enemies of Israel that they will suffer because of their disobedience at the second coming. So this is specifically those armies that had gathered with Antichrist to war against firstly Jerusalem and then Bosra. Now the first judgment will be in the form of a plague. This word is used to describe a divine judgment which brings death to unbelievers, as seen in Exodus 9 verse 14, Exodus 9 verse 14, and Numbers 14:47, Numbers 14 verse 47. This is which the Lord will smite or strike all the peoples who have chosen to wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh, that is their physical bodies, will rot. This word means to decay or decompose, or putrefy, to stink. They will turn rotten. In a sense, their outward physical appearance will match their inward spiritual rottenness. Because remember, these ones have taken the mark of the beast. But whereas normal human decomposition normally takes quite some time, usually several years, this process will occur so quickly that they'll still be standing on their feet as they rot. And then Zechariah specifically mentions the eyes. And that's interesting because back in chapter 2, verse 8, Zechariah had specifically called Israel the apple of God's eye. For thus says the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. Behold, I will shake my hand over them, and they shall be plunder for those who serve them. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. And of course, we can keep in mind the principle of the Abrahamic covenant that those who dishonor you, I will curse. And often we see it's a like for like curse. Then we see, of course, that these nations had dared to destroy Israel, the apple of God's eye. So now their eyes will be destroyed. Just as their bodies rot, so too their eyes will rot, right in their very sockets. And it's also interesting to reflect on the fact that Jesus refers to the eyes being the window to the soul. Matthew 6:22-23. So again, I see here a picture of an outward revelation of an inward reality. The outward rottenness that's occurring is a reflection of their spiritual corruption. They are utterly corrupt in all facets of body, soul, and spirit, with the other part rotting being mentioned here being the tongue, which brings to mind James's statement that the tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. So one of the things that people who take the mark have to do is they have to worship the Antichrist and call him God. And so they've been acknowledging the satanically inspired being as God. And so this is setting them under God's judgment. So what comes to mind when in terms of why this rapid decomposition is occurring? Well, a key factor would be exposure to heat. Zechariah mentions God's consuming fire back in chapter 9 verse 4 when speaking of a divine judgment on Tyre. Now fire isn't mentioned in this particular passage, but a similar principle most probably applies. These armies encounter the fire of God's judgments and wrath and so are consumed. But wait, there's more. The fear of the Lord's divine judgment creates a great panic amongst this fleeing enemy. So much so that probably in a literal blind panic, as in they've got mounting eyes, they can't really see, they attack anyone or anything that comes across their path. Keep in mind that these are the armies of Antichrist. So again, as I mentioned, they have taken the mark of the beast. And they had, alongside the entire world, been warned by one of three angels that if they did take the mark, they would indeed fall under divine judgment, as they are here. The reference, Revelation 14:9-11, Revelation 14, 9 to 11. So this plague then is part of that divine judgment. Now Judah, who were located in Bosra when Messiah returned, will travel north and be involved in helping Messiah rescue those who were trapped in Jerusalem. Now, similar to Israel after the Exodus, when they received the great wealth of Egypt, that's in Exodus 12:35 to 36. Here, in this future context, following the second coming, the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be delivered to the nation of Israel, including gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And finally, the Lord, again, as we see in Exodus 12, verse 29, brings a plague on the animals of the enemies as well. So at this point, the tribulation has ended and we are now going to enter into the aftermath. Now this, according to Daniel, is an interval period of 75 days. However, Zechariah, in the remainder of this chapter, is now going to shift his focus onto events that occur during the time of the messianic millennial kingdom. So in summary, in this first part of this chapter, we've seen Zechariah give more details about the campaign of Armageddon. In particular, what happens to Jerusalem after it falls, which will, of course, remember this is Antichrist's last victory. And in particular, so that's going to be his last victory. And then following this, Messiah returns then to defeat Antichrist when he's moving on the remnant in Bosra. And having defeated the armies there, and Messiah then moves north, as we saw Isaiah picturing him, to Jerusalem. And then having wiped out the remaining army, he then completes the battle of victory up to the Mount of Olives at the end. And this will result in a massive earthquake, which will then split the Mount of Olives in two on an east-west axis, which then enables those who have been imprisoned after the defeat of Jerusalem to escape out into the valley. And Zechariah then describes the divine judgment of a plague that strikes the enemy army, which causes their bodies, eyes, and tongues to rot as they stand, with the spoils of war now going to the Jewish nation. So in our next and final session, after a short break, we're going to complete chapter 14, and Zechariah is going to move from the end of the tribulation and the aftermath into the messianic kingdom.